Welcome to channel Qtomation. From this session we will start about data driven testing. So what exactly is data driven testing? So data driven testing is a software testing method in which test data is stored in table or spreadsheet format. So why we need a data driven testing? So let's say it allows testers to input a single test script that can execute tests for all the test data from a table and expect the test output in the same table. So let's say there is a scenario where we want to execute or perform the same test steps but with multiple test data. So let's say there is a scenario where we want to execute the same script steps but with multiple type of test data. So where we can store that test data, we can store that test data inside a spreadsheet or inside a table. That's why it is called a table driven testing or parameterized testing. So we can fetch the data from that Excel sheet, or we can also write the result or the output data into the same spreadsheet. That is the benefit of data driven testing. So we can utilize the same script and we can provide the different type of input data or the test data to that test script that can produce the different type of outputs, and we can also write the output or the outcome into the test sheet as well. By default, Selenium does not support Excel sheet. So by default, Selenium does not support Excel sheet. So we know that WebDriver Selenium is basically used for test automation with the web elements. So we can automate, we can use different type of commands to automate the web elements. But by default, Selenium does not support Excel sheet. So we cannot use directly by using Selenium WebDriver. So we have to use some third-party modules. For example, we will see openpyxl module. So openpyxl module, we can import it, and after that we can use various type of methods and functions which this module provides, and we can perform different type of operations on the Excel sheet. openpyxl is a Python library for reading and writing Excel. If you want to read the data from Excel sheet, or we can write the data to Excel sheet as well by using openpyxl library. We can work with XLSX and XLSM files. So we will see practically how we can read the data from Excel file in this session, and in the next session we will see how we can write the data into the Excel file. It is very simple. By using openpyxl, it is very simple. So first we have to understand the Excel structure for that. So this is the part of the data driven testing. So first we will understand how to read the data from Excel file. Then we will understand how to write the data to Excel file. And once we understand both the things, we will move to data driven testing and how we can utilize reading and writing the data into Excel file for data driven testing. So first, let's understand the structure of Excel file. So the Excel file basically is a file. So whenever we create .xlsx file, so I will just go to desktop and we have some file here. So this is the xlsx file, my test file. This is the new xlsx file which we have created. I am just hiding the extension so we can just show you the extensions as well. If you see, this is the xlsx file which we have created, and in this my test file, so this is the file. Inside this file, if you open it, I am just opening that xlsx file. When you open the file, you can see this is the workbook. Whenever we open the file, we open the workbook, and workbook can contain multiple test sheets. So this is the one sheet, my EMPS list. This is the one sheet containing some data in this file. If you see, there is ID, name and location. These are the column names. If you see, it is divided into rows and columns. So basically we have file which is located at some file path. Inside that there is a workbook. Workbook can contain multiple sheets. If you see, this is the first sheet, this is the second sheet. I can add as many sheets I can. So there can be multiple sheets present inside the workbook. So this is basically the structure, and inside every sheet there are rows and columns. If you see A, B, C, D up to Z, there are different type of columns, and there is number 1, 2, 3, 4. These are basically rows. And combination of rows and columns provide the cells. So this is basically a cell. If you see, these are the columns A, B, C, D, E, F, G and so on, and these are the rows 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. These are the rows, and by the combination of rows and columns, they form the cells, and every cell contains some data here. If you see, these are the empty cells, and these cells are containing some test data. So what we want to do is, we want to fetch or we want to read the data from this Excel file. We have the file, and we will see how we can use openpyxl to fetch the data from this Excel file. So I want to extract the data from this Excel file. This is basically a sheet. So the structure is, there is a file present at any path which we have created. So we create the new we create new XLX file that is present at any one location. That file contains workbook. Workbook can contain multiple sheets, and the sheet contain rows and columns, and those basically are cells. So combination of rows and columns is basically cells, and every cell can contain some type of data, or it can be empty as well. So what we want to do is, we want to fetch the data from the cells. Now we will see practically how we can perform it. So we have to use openpyxl module. So for that we have to first install openpyxl module in our project. I will show you practically how we can import openpyxl module. So I am just going to PyCharm. Inside this, we have to select the project, go to File, inside the file go to Settings, inside the file go to Setting, then select Python interpreter, and once you select this Python interpreter, you can see all the different type of modules which we are imported in our project. I have already imported openpyxl module, but if you haven't, what you can do is, you can simply click on this plus icon, that is the install button. Once you click on this install, you can see this screen, and here we have to just type. So inside this, after clicking on plus icon, we have to just type openpyxl. So it will show you openpyxl module here. It is a Python library to read and write Excel 2010, XLSX and XLSM files. I have already installed it. You can simply click on install package and it will install that openpyxl module in your project. So I will just reiterate one more time. So we have to select the project first, go to File, then select Settings, Python interpreter, then click on plus icon, and here you can just type the module name, that is openpyxl, and then click on install package. It will automatically install openpyxl module in your project. I am just closing it because I have already installed it. I am not again installing it. And once you install successfully, you can see that package, or we can see the module in this module list. So that means we have successfully installed openpyxl module in our project. So after importing the openpyxl module, now let's see practically how we can read the data from our Excel file. So this is the Excel file which we have opened. File name is my test file. Inside my test file, we have one table which contains the data, ID, name and location. There are total 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5 rows. And how many columns? 1, 2 and 3. This is one column, this is second column and this is third column. These are the 5 rows and 3 columns. So we want to read the data from this 5 rows and 3 columns. And what is the sheet name here? My EMPS list. This is the sheet name. Now this workbook contains 2 sheets. My EMPS list and my fruits list. These are the 2 sheets which this workbook is containing. So first we will read the data from first sheet. And then we will read the data from second sheet as well. Now first let's check it out how we can read the data from this table. What is the workbook name is my test file, file name is my test file and sheet name is my EMPS list. So we have to close the file. To read the data first we have to close the file. If your file is open then it will throw the error. So let's close this file. Now let's go back to PyCharm. In the PyCharm we will create a new Python file. Let's create a new Python file. I am naming it as Excel data reading demo. So we have created a Python file. And what is the next step? We have to import openpyxl module. So we have to just import openpyxl module. That is the first step. And it's very simple guys. So we have to just remember the structure. So file, there would be a file. File will contain the workbook. Workbook can contain sheet. It can be a single sheet or it can be a multiple sheet as well. And sheet will contain cell. So basically sheet will contain rows and columns which will form the cells. And we want to fetch the data from this cell. There can be multiple cells. There will be multiple cells. So now let's go step by step. So first step is we have to locate the file. So file is present at which location? So the file from which we want to read the data, first we have to locate that file. So what is the file name? So I will just select the file, right click on it, copy the path of the file. So I am just copying the path of the file. We can create one variable, let's say file path, or we can simply name it as, we can give any name. I'm just naming it as file equal to, we have to provide the file path. So I'm just pasting the file path. We can use double backslashes. So this is the file path. This file path is stored in this variable, that is file. So we have done the first step. What is the next step is we have to load the workbook. After file we have to load the workbook. So how we can load the workbook is, there is a command openpyxl dot load workbook method, and in this we have to provide the path, right? We have to provide the path of the file which we want to load from the workbook. So we have already stored that path in this file variable. So I will just pass this file variable here. And we can store this in one variable that is called as a workbook. We can give any name. I am just giving it as a workbook. So we are loading the workbook here after providing the file path. So second step is also done. Next step is we have to read the sheet now. So inside the workbook there is a sheet, and what was the sheet name? EMPS. So what was the sheet name? I will just open one more time. So let's open this file. So we are just checking the sheet name from which we want to read the data. So we are just opening that file one more time. And we want to read the data from which sheet? So sheet name is my EMPS list. Remember the sheet name, my EMPS list. So this is the sheet and this is the data which is present inside the sheet. So I am just closing it. Let's go back to PyCharm. So when we want to read from the sheet, we can use the following method. So I'm just creating one variable, let's say sheet equals to workbook, and there are multiple sheets, right? So if there is only single sheet, then we can use workbook. So as there are two sheets, right? So I will show you there are two ways we can read the data from the sheet. First one is if there are only one sheet. Now we have seen if there is only one sheet, then we can use workbook.active. But since there are multiple sheets, there are two sheets. So for that, what I will do, we have to provide the name of the sheet. So what was the name? My EMPS list. That was the sheet name. So we are loading that sheet, or we are creating that sheet into the sheet variable. And after reaching up to the sheet, so we have reached up to this point. So we are now up to this point. After that, we want to read the data from cells. So for that, we have to know rows and columns, right? So we have to first understand rows and columns. So what I will do, I will create one variable, let's say row. I will create one more variable, let's say column, or let's say col. So we want to read the data, right? But how many rows and how many columns data we want to read? So if you see, there are, I will just one more time open that sheet. So if you see, we have to read the data. So from which row and which column we want to read the data? We want to print all the data. We want to read all the data. So how many rows are there? 5 rows and 3 columns. 5 rows and 3 columns. And remaining are blank cells. So those are not containing any type of data. So what we will do, there is one method by which we can count the sheet rows and sheet columns as well, which contains the active data. So we will just use sheet dot max underscore row, and for column we can use sheet dot max underscore column. So what it will return? It will return the row number and count total number of column numbers. So it will return rows and columns which contains some data. So we can simply print as well. So I will just show you. Let's print rows containing data are number of rows containing data are, and similarly we can also print for column as well. Number of columns containing data are, and we can print the value of row. We can give it as a rows and cols, and here we can also print the value of cols as well. We have to provide the comma as well, and we have to close this file. So how many rows are there? 5 rows and 3 columns. I am just closing this sheet, and let's execute this file, and let's see whether it can give us number of rows and number of columns which contains the active data. So let's execute this file. Let's execute this file. So if you see, number of rows containing data are 5 and number of columns containing data are 3. So it is giving correct number of rows and columns from which we want to read the data. So we are successfully calculating the rows and columns which contains the data. I am just commenting this. Now we want to read the data. So now we want to actually read the data from those rows and columns from each individual cells. So for that, what are the next step is, we are going to use for loop. We have to use for loop for rows as well and for columns as well. We have to use two for loops, nested for loop for rows and columns, because we want to iterate. So first we will select the first row. After that we will fetch the data from first row, first column. So how we will go is, so by using for loop we will iterate from each row and each column. So in the first for loop, what we will do, we will first fetch the data from first row and first column. Then we will fetch the data from first row, second column. Then we will fetch the data from first row and third column. That is the first iteration. Then we will select the next row, second row first column, second row second column, second row third column. Then we will move to next iteration, third row first column, third row second column, third row third column, and so on. So we will reach to fourth row first column, fourth row second column, fourth row third column, and then fifth row first column, fifth row second column, fifth row third column. So for that we need two for loops. So inside one for loop for rows iteration and another for loop for columns iteration. So I am just closing this file one more time. Let's go back to PyCharm. Let's write one for r in rows. This for loop for rows iteration, and after that we have to use for c in calls. This is for column iteration, and we have to use one method. Now we have to read the data. So there is one method sheet.cell, and in this cell we have to provide row number, that is r, and column number, and then we have to fetch the value from it. So dot value. So this method will give you the value from specific cells. One by one it will take first row first column, first row second column, first row third column, then second row first column, and so on. So it will fetch the value, and we want to print that value, right? So we want to print also. So print sheet.cell, and then we have to provide row number, column number, and then dot value. So it will print the values. But there is one small problem. If you see, let's execute this file and let's check it out. So I'm just running this file. If you see, there is a type error. So what we can do is, instead of using for in loop, so we have used for in loop, right? So we should not use for in. Instead of that we can use the range function. So for r in range, function, it will start with 1 comma rows. So how many rows are there? 5 rows. But we know that for range function it will always go up to one value less. That means if you provide 1 and 5, it will iterate from 1 to 4 only. So that we have to provide plus 1 here. Then it will iterate from 1 to 5. And similarly for column as well, we have to use range function. For c in range, we have to provide 1 comma column numbers plus 1, because rows are 5. 1 and 5 if you use in range function, it will iterate from 1 to 4 only, because it is always minus 1. So we have to provide, we want to, how many rows are there? 5 rows. So we should provide 1 and 6, that means rows plus 1. Also for columns we have to provide range function 1 comma columns plus 1. And now if you execute this, we should be able to see the data which we can fetch. We want to fetch, if you see, all the data which we want to fetch, it is printing here. So I will just show you one more time. If you see ID, name, location, this is again ID, name, location, ID, name, location, up to the last row. If you see, up to the last row. So let's see the data as well. So I'm just opening this file one more time. So if you see, all the data is now printed here. If you see, all the data is printed here from my EMPS list. So we are printing the data from my EMPS list. If you see ID, there are 4 values. So if you see the data here, all the data is printed here. All the data from rows and columns from every sheet, it is printed here. But it is not looking in correct format, right? If you see, I want to format this data. So what we can do is, we can simply provide, after ending this for loop, so when we are coming out of this for loop, I will just use print some blank space. So after printing the data from first row, So after printing the data from this first row, we are providing some blank space. It will go up to the next line. So let's execute this time. Let's execute this file and let's see the output. So if you see, this is the data from first row, this is the data from second row, this is from third row, and this is from fourth row, and this is from fifth row from my EMPS list sheet name. Again, if you want to format some more in this, let's say I want to view the data in kind of a tabular format here. So what we can do is, for that also what we can do, in this print statement, after this dot value we can provide comma and then end equals to some blank space here. And now let's execute this file. So let's execute this file, and if you see the output now, it is provided in good looking format, right? So if you see, this is the first row, second row, third row, fourth row, and fifth row. So the entire data we are now successfully reading from the Excel file. So what are the steps we have followed here? Let's reiterate one more time. We have to first import the openpyxl module. We have to first import openpyxl module. We have to remember the structure. So there is a file. File will contain workbook. Workbook can contain multiple sheet. It can contain single sheet as well as multiple sheet. Depends on the requirements. And every sheet will contain some cells. Every sheet will contain rows and columns which will form the cells. Then we have created the file variable which stores the path of that file from which we want to read the data. Then we are loading the workbook by using openpyxl.loadWorkbook method, and here we have to pass the file path. After workbook, we have to give the name of the sheet here. So we have used name of the sheet from which we want to read the data in the sheet variable, and from this sheet variable we can count maximum number of rows and maximum number of columns which contains active data. So it will give the number of rows and number of columns which contains the data. And after that we can use range function. So two times we have to use the for loop. First one for rows and second one for columns. And we can simply use sheet.cell method. Sheet.cell method will provide, after passing the row number and column number, we can fetch the value and we can print the value in our console. So this is how we can read the data from Excel file. Now if you see, we have successfully read the data from first sheet. What was the name? We just have to provide the name here. My EMPS list. So this is the data we have which we have fetched. Now let's say there is another sheet, my fruits list, which contains country, fruit name, quantity. I want to print this data as well now. So instead of say first one, I want to print the data from second sheet. So only change we have to do is just change the name. So if you see my fruits list, this is the name. I will go back to PyCharm. In the PyCharm, here we are giving the name of the sheet. So I will just change the name. I will just use my fruits list. And now if I run the file, it should print all the data value from that sheet. So I will just execute this file. It will throw the error because the file is still open. Yeah, but it can still show the file. But for safety, I am just closing this file. If you see, it is reading the data successfully. Country, fruit, name and quantity. Now all the data we are successfully reading from second sheet as well. So here we have to just change the name. So this is how we can read the data from Excel sheet. In the next session we will see how we can write the data into Excel sheet. That is again very simple. It is very similar to reading the data, just couple of steps which we have to change. So we have seen how to read the data from the Excel file. In the next session we will see how to write the data into Excel file. So thank you for watching.